Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something super interesting, the connection between animal consciousness and the law of one.
Yeah, it should be a fascinating discussion. We've got such an eclectic mix of sources too. Academic papers,
Yeah.
scientific reports, philosophical excerpts, and of course selections from the Law of One itself.
It's to be wild.
It really is. I think what's so interesting about this topic is that it makes us think about one of the biggest mysteries out there.
Like what?
Well, what is consciousness?
Right.
And if we can find it in animals, what does that mean for how we see them?
Exactly. And one of the papers we're looking at today goes right to the heart of that. Science Asks Conscience, animal-anglais.coc.pdf. It points out just how subjective the experience of consciousness is, especially for us humans. It makes studying it in animals a huge challenge.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how full-text T01.pdf defines consciousness, though. It focuses on how it's experiential and sensory, and they break it down into these key features: qualitative richness, situatedness, intentionality, integration, dynamics, and stability.
Okay, so qualitative richness. That's like how vivid our senses are,
Yeah.
right? And situatedness means we experience things in a specific context, time, and place.
Yeah, exactly.
Then there's intentionality, which suggests our thoughts are going towards something.
That's a great way to put it. And we can't forget about integration, where we perceive things as a whole, not just little bits of information. Then you've got the interplay of dynamics and stability.
Okay.
The way our experiences are always shifting, but there's this continuous thread of awareness going through it all.
It's kind of like a river, always flowing, but always there.
Yeah, great analogy.
So thinking about all of this, what parts of consciousness do you find most interesting? And how do you think they might show up in the animal world?
That's a great question and something to think about as we go forward. Now, when we look at Science Asks Conscience, animal-anglais.doc.pdf, we see this comprehensive review of studies that suggest different types of consciousness are present in vertebrates.
Okay.
And get this includes livestock and fish.
Hold on, fish. Really? I was just kind of picture them swimming around, on autopilot, just reacting to stuff.
It might seem that way, but, we got to be careful about jumping to conclusions. The research is really complex. But there is some interesting evidence coming out. For example, ABC 2019 vol64 comstock.pdf shows studies that point to metacognition in rats.
We have metacognition in rats.
Yeah.
So they're not just responding to things, they're thinking about their thinking.
It seems that way.
That's crazy. Are there other examples like that?
There are. That same source, ABC 2019 vol64 comstock.pdf, also mentions studies on self-awareness in primates. We've all seen those videos of chimpanzees recognizing themselves in mirror.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And then if we go back to Science Asks Conscience, animal-anglais.doc.pdf, there are discussions of social awareness in herbivores.
Like what?
Like how they seem to understand and respond to each other's emotions in their group?
So we're seeing all these potential signs of consciousness in so many different animals. It makes you wonder how much we're missing, and it brings up some ethical questions about how we treat them.
Absolutely. Science Asks Conscience, animal-anglais.doc.pdf really dives into those ethical implications.
Yeah.
If animals do have these varying levels of consciousness, it really challenges how we think about their ability to suffer and experience the world.
Definitely. Now, to add another layer to all of this, let's look at things from an evolutionary standpoint. Animal Consciousness Creer0.pdf and VATE 2023 Preview A Philosophy for Science of Animal Consciousness.pdf both look at consciousness from that lens of natural selection.
It's really interesting how those sources look at the how and why of consciousness developing over time. They even talk about this idea of pathological complexity.
Pathological complexity.
Yeah.
Okay, what's that?
It's this idea that certain lifestyles might have actually pushed the evolution of conscious awareness.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Can you explain that a little more?
Okay, so imagine an animal that lives in a really complex and ever-changing environment. They always have to solve new problems and adapt to unexpected situations,
Right.
make flexible decisions. That kind of pressure could favor the development of a more complex brain.
So it's not just about survival.
Yeah.
It's about thriving in tough spots that could have pushed consciousness to emerge.
Exactly. And when we look at the big picture, it really shows how diverse intelligence is in nature.
Yeah.
Consciousness probably took many forms shaped by each species' own evolutionary journey.
All right, my mind is already blown. Now, how does the law of one fit into all of this? I'm really excited to talk about that.
Me too. It's definitely a unique way to look at things. If you look at the law of one material, specifically books 1 through 4, It describes consciousness as this fundamental part of the universe coming from this one infinite creator.
And then there's the whole system of densities, right?
Yes.
Describing how consciousness evolves through those different levels of awareness and understanding.
Exactly. The law of one really emphasizes free will and how important our choices are.
Like how we choose to polarize.
Yeah, whether we're moving towards service to others or service to self as we move through these densities. And in the Law Phone book, itherimaterial.b.pdf, they even talk about how challenges and experiences can speed up our spiritual evolution.
So we're talking about this cosmic system where consciousness is always evolving,
Yes.
and our choices are super important. But how do we tie this back to animal consciousness?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The Law of One has some intriguing ideas that could connect these worlds of science and metaphysics. Have you ever heard of the concept of harvest in the Law of One?
I have, but remind me.
Sure. It's this idea that beings can graduate to higher densities based on their spiritual progress.
Okay, I'm with you. So how might that idea of harvest relate to how animals evolve consciousness through the densities?
That's something to think about, isn't it? And to make things even more interesting, the Law Phone book, itherimaterial.by.pdf, talks about entities being transferred to Earth from Mars.
Whoa, entities from Mars. Okay, now we're getting into some crazy stuff.
I know, right? And it brings up questions about how consciousness might evolve across planets. Maybe Earth's history is more complicated than we think, with other beings and their journeys through consciousness.
So we're talking about this potentially massive and connected web of consciousness,
Yeah.
spanning species, planets, and densities. This is blowing my mind. But let's bring it back down to Earth for a second.
Okay.
What does all of this really mean for us? How does knowing about animal consciousness and the law of one change our perspective on our place in the universe? How do we even begin to integrate these ideas into our lives?
Those are great questions, and that's exactly what we'll be looking at as we continue our deep dive.
Awesome, I can't wait.
Welcome back. We left off talking about that wild concept from the Law Phone book, itherimaterial.by.pdf. You know, the idea that entities were transferred to Earth from Mars.
Right, I'm still thinking about that one. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. It makes us consider if there could be other conscious beings right here with us, maybe even influencing our evolution.
Before the break, you mentioned this idea connects to the law of one's concept of harvest. Can you tell me more about that?
Of course. In the Law of One, harvest basically means beings graduating to higher densities based on how they've grown spiritually. So think about those Martian entities for a second. What if coming to Earth was part of their own harvest process? Like, what if Earth helped them keep growing spiritually?
So you're saying Earth could be like a training ground for consciousness,
Yeah.
where beings from other planets come to evolve.
It's a really interesting idea, and it brings up more questions like, what density were those Martian beings at? Were they second density beings about to become third density, or were they already third density, maybe even more advanced than early humans?
You know, I never thought about it that way. If they were already third density, it suggests a whole other level of consciousness was here on this planet with us.
Exactly. And if they were second density moving towards third, it adds another layer to this harvest thing. Maybe the challenges and opportunities on Earth were there to help them evolve spiritually.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. It's like we're putting together a huge cosmic puzzle, but with some crazy pieces.
Yeah.
You mentioned before that the law of one talks about densities as stages of spiritual evolution. Can you explain that a little more for our listeners?
Sure. Think of densities as levels of awareness and understanding. First density is basic awareness, like plants and minerals. Second density is about growth and instincts. That's where animals fit in. Third density is the one we're in as humans, and it's all about self-awareness and free will.
So third density is where we make those big choices about how we want to interact with the world.
Yes.
Service to self or service to others, right?
Exactly. And as we make those choices, we move towards either fourth density, which is all about love and understanding, or a path that's more self-focused.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about animals? Where do they fit into this whole density thing? Do they evolve through them too?
That's a great question. The Law of One doesn't really go into detail about how animals evolve through densities, but there are some hints. Remember harvest. Could it be that animals, as they go through second density, also experience a kind of harvest?
So you're saying animals could potentially graduate to fourth density too. What would that even look like?
It's a really interesting possibility to think about. Imagine a world where animals, having developed consciousness and compassion, move to a higher level of existence. Do they transition as individual souls, or is there maybe a group soul for a whole species? These are questions that go beyond what we currently understand.
This is wild. It really challenges how we usually think about animals and makes you wonder about the true scope of consciousness on Earth.
And remember, we're just scratching the surface here. What's so cool about exploring these concepts is that it opens up more questions than answers. It makes us think about the mysteries of existence and see beyond our limited human perspective.
Okay, I'm definitely feeling that expansion. But I gotta be honest, I'm also a little overwhelmed. It's a lot to process, and it's tough to know how to even start incorporating these ideas into our lives. What advice would you give to someone who's just starting to look into these things?
That's a great point. It's important to approach these concepts with an open mind and be willing to question what we think we know. Remember, the law of one encourages us to find our own truth, not to just blindly believe one perspective.
So it's not about finding all the answers. It's
Yeah.
more about going on a journey of exploration and discovery.
Exactly. And living the law within the choice.pdf actually gives some really practical guidance for this journey. It emphasizes making choices that are aligned with love and understanding. And that includes how we treat animals, too.
Right. If we really see their consciousness, our responsibility to them becomes so much bigger than just food and shelter.
Yes.
It's about respecting their sentience, their ability to feel, and their own paths of evolution.
Absolutely. It also makes us look at our own beliefs and how we act. Are we really living in line with the law of one? Do our actions show love and compassion for everyone, including animals?
You know, it's easy to get caught up in our human world and forget about how connected everything is.
It really is.
The law of one really pushes us to see beyond ourselves and recognize that spark of consciousness in every living thing. But how do we actually develop that kind of awareness in our everyday lives?
Well, living the law from the choice.pdf suggests some practical ways to do that. It talks about incorporating things like meditation and mindfulness.
Okay.
These practices can help us step outside of our limited views and connect with a deeper sense of unity.
So it's not just about understanding these concepts in our heads.
No.
It's about living them through our choices and action.
Yes.
It's about remembering we're all part of this big cosmic dance evolving together.
Beautifully said. It's about realizing our actions ripple out and affect the whole web of consciousness. And that can be really powerful.
I love that. But I'm still wrestling with one piece of this puzzle. The idea of densities and harvest. It's kind of abstract. Can you make it a little more concrete, maybe relate it back to animal consciousness?
Sure. Let's think about harvest in the context of animal consciousness. The law of own book material b.pdf mentions that in third density, beings are harvested individually based on their spiritual progress.
Okay, so if we apply that to animals, are you saying there's a chance they could be harvested into fourth density too, based on how they've progressed?
Now, that's a thought-provoking question, isn't it? And if so, what does that transition look like for them? Do they keep their individual consciousness, or do they maybe merge into a collective consciousness for their species?
Wow, these are some seriously fascinating questions. It makes you wonder about the true nature of consciousness and how it could exist in ways we can't even imagine.
And that's where things start to get really exciting. It makes us rethink what we believe about consciousness and consider the possibility that it exists in ways we haven't even thought of.
All right, my mind is doing flips. We've gone from exploring animal consciousness to talking about interplanetary travel, and now we're diving into densities and harvest.
Yeah.
But there's one concept we haven't really talked about yet, negative polarization. It's something that a lot of people misunderstand, don't you think?
You're right. It's easy to just think of negative as bad or evil. But the law of one looks at it differently.
Right. It's not about good versus evil. It's about choosing to serve yourself instead of others. But how does that apply to animals? Can we even say that some animals are negatively polarized?
That's where things get tricky, and we need to be careful. We're getting into territory where we might be guessing more than we know for sure. But it's an interesting question to think about. If consciousness is everywhere, does the idea of polarity apply to all forms of life? Are there animals who, in their own way, are choosing that path of serving themselves?
That's a really tough idea to wrap your head around. It makes us rethink what we might see as negative behaviors in animals. Could things we see as aggressive or predatory be part of a different evolutionary path, a path of service to self?
It's definitely a perspective that needs a lot of nuance and thought. We need to avoid projecting our human values onto animals. But it reminds us that consciousness is vast and complex, full of intricate relationships and different evolutionary journeys.
I totally agree. This whole discussion has been such a journey. We've explored animal consciousness, learned about the law of one, and talked about polarity and evolution. But like always, it feels like we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to uncover.
That's what makes it so amazing, right? The exploration never really ends. There's always more to discover, more to learn, and more to understand about ourselves and the universe.
You're so right. This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. What are your final thoughts as we wrap up this part of our exploration?
Wow, it really has been quite a journey, hasn't it? We've covered so much ground, from the scientific evidence for animal consciousness to the mind-bending concepts from the Law of One.
It really has. I
Yeah.
feel like we've opened up a whole new universe of possibilities. You know, it challenges how we usually think about animals and our place in the big scheme of things.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's really important to remember that this is just the beginning of exploring all of this. What we've done here is plant some seeds of curiosity so you can keep thinking about these ideas and finding your own understanding.
I love that. And it's all about inspiring that sense of wonder in our listeners,
Yeah.
inviting them to join us on this journey of discovery.
Yeah.
But before we go, is there anything from our conversation that you'd like to emphasize? What's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
That's a great question. If I had to pick one key takeaway from this deep dive, it would be the idea of interconnectedness. We've seen hints of it throughout our discussion, from scientific evidence showing shared abilities across different species to the law of one's vision of a universe connected by consciousness.
Yeah, that idea of interconnectedness really struck me too. And it's beautifully expressed in Living the Law Often on the Choice.pdf. We're all one, though seemingly separate. It's such a simple statement, but it's so profound. If we can really embrace that understanding, it changes everything.
It really does. It changes how we interact with animals, how we relate to each other, and how we see ourselves in the universe. It reminds us that we're not isolated individuals, but threads in this huge tapestry of existence.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But how do we put that understanding into action? It's easy to get caught up in everyday life and forget about these big interconnected concepts.
That's such a crucial point. It's not enough to just understand these ideas in our heads. We need to live them in our daily lives. Living the Law Waffle in the Choice.pdf emphasizes the importance of making choices that align with love and understanding.
So it's about making those conscious choices right.
Yes.
Those small acts of kindness and compassion that show we understand interconnectedness.
Exactly. And as we become more aware, we start to see all the subtle ways we're connected. It helps create a more harmonious and compassionate world for everyone.
And that brings us back to those practical tools we talked about before, like meditation and mindfulness. They can help us develop that heart-centered awareness, that deep connection to everything around us.
Exactly. They help us step outside of our limited egos and tap into a deeper understanding of ourselves and our place in the universe. We can experience that interconnectedness instead of just thinking about it.
This has been an incredible journey of discovery. But as always, it feels like we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore and think about and to bring into our lives.
That's the beauty of it all, right? This journey of exploring consciousness, whether in ourselves, in animals, or through the Law of One, never really ends. It's a path of always learning and discovering something new.
I love that. So to our listeners, we leave you with this final thought. If consciousness is truly a universal principle, like the Law of One says, what does that mean for how we understand ourselves, our relationships with other beings, and even the nature of reality itself? Keep thinking about those questions as you continue your own explorations.
And as you go through the ups and downs of life, remember that everything is connected and let love be your guide. Until next time, may you find peace and harmony.